Apply. Imagine a world where the sea is not just water, but a highway of fear, where the sight of a longship's dragon head slicing through the fog meant only one thing. Apply. Chaos was about to descend. The thunder of shields, the clash of swords, and the roar of warriors who seemed unstoppable. This was the Viking Age. Tonight, Apply, we take you back to the brutal raids that shook Europe to its core, a saga of blood, fire, and power that rewrote history. Apply. From monasteries set ablaze to kingdoms trembling at the very mention of their name, the Vikings carved their story into Europe's soul like no other. Apply. And here's the twist. Beyond the myths of horned helmets and wild barbarians lies a deeper truth. These Norse warriors weren't just raiders, they were explorers, settlers, Apply, and visionaries who shaped the very walls of Europe's beginning. So hold tight, because what you're about to hear are not just stories, but mysteries, secrets, Apply, and astonishing facts that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the Vikings. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe, Apply, and comment. Your support helps us bring history's most fascinating tales back to life. It was the year 793 AD, Apply, and Europe was about to witness a moment that would echo through history. The waves of the North Sea carry with them something far more terrifying than a storm. Out of the morning mist, Apply, sleek wooden ships emerge, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the water like blades. To the monks of Lindisfarne, an isolated monastery off the northeast coast of England, Apply, the sight must have felt unreal, a vision sent to test their faith. For centuries, Lindisfarne had been a place of quiet devotion, a sanctuary where prayer echoed louder than war. Apply, where illuminated manuscripts shone brighter than swords. But on that day, the silence was shattered forever. The longships reached the shore, Apply, and from them poured men unlike any the monks had seen. Tall, fierce, their hair braided, their shields glinting in the weak sun, Apply, the Vikings stormed the holy island with a fury that seemed almost otherworldly. They were not soldiers in shining armor, bound by the rules of kings or the codes of knights. Apply. They were raiders driven by hunger, ambition, and the promise of untold riches. For them, Lindisfarne was not a place of holiness, but a treasure chest waiting to be broken open. Apply. The monastery's wooden doors offered little resistance. The Vikings smashed through, dragging monks from their prayers, tearing apart sacred relics, Apply, and seizing gold and silver crosses that had been crafted to honor saints. To the invaders, it was plunder. To Europe, it was sacrilege, blood mixed with the ink of manuscripts, Apply, and the flames that licked the monastery walls seemed to declare the dawn of a new and terrifying era. Word of the attack spread with the speed of fire in dry grass. Apply. Lindisfarne had been more than a holy site. It was a symbol of faith for Christendom, and its destruction sent shockwaves across kingdoms already fragile and divided. If a monastery, Apply, under the protection of God, could be brought down by these strangers from the north, then who or what could possibly stand against them? Apply. Chroniclers of the time described the event with horror, calling it a harbinger of doom, and to many it must have felt like the end of the world. Apply. Kings and priests alike struggled to explain how God could allow such desecration. Some saw it as punishment for sins, others as a warning of greater chaos to come. But for the Vikings, Apply, Lindisfarne was proof of their power, a declaration to all of Europe: we are here and we will not be ignored. Apply. This single raid marked the beginning of what would later be called the Viking Age. 2 centuries of raids, invasions, and conquests that would redraw the map of Europe. Apply. Lindisfarne was not chosen by accident. Its isolation, its treasures, and its lack of defenses made it the perfect target. Apply. The Vikings knew that striking fear was as powerful as wielding a sword, and with Lindisfarne they succeeded beyond imagination. Yet behind the brutality there was strategy. Apply. These raiders weren't mindless savages as legend often paints them. They understood the psychology of terror. Apply. By striking at a monastery, the very heart of Europe's spiritual life, they sent a message that no place, no matter how sacred, was safe. Apply. Their reputation grew larger than their numbers, and long before they reached other shores, the dread of their arrival traveled ahead of them. Apply. The raid on Lindisfarne was not just an act of violence, it was the spark that lit the Viking Age. It was the moment Europe realized that a new force had risen from the north. Apply. One that would test its kingdoms, challenge its faith, and ultimately leave a mark so deep that we still speak of it more than 1,000 years later. Apply. The seas were the Vikings' true kingdom, and their mastery of the waters was the secret behind their terrifying power. Imagine, for a moment, Apply, the endless horizon stretching in every direction, waves crashing like restless giants, and out of that vast expanse emerging long, narrow vessels unlike any others in the world. Apply. These were not simple ships. They were weapons, floating fortresses, and symbols of innovation. To Europe's kingdoms, they were the harbingers of doom, but to the Vikings, they were freedom, opportunity, and destiny carved into wood. The Viking longship was a marvel of its time, crafted with such precision that modern historians still marvel at its design. Its hull, built with overlapping planks, gave it the strength to endure raging seas while remaining light enough to be carried across land when needed. The ships were symmetrical, meaning they could reverse direction without turning, a vital advantage when raiding shallow coasts or fleeing enemies. With a shallow draft, these vessels could sail in open oceans, yet glide into rivers and estuaries, reaching the heart of Europe where no army expected them. Imagine the terror of villagers deep inland, hearing the sudden thunder of oars on the water and realizing the Vikings had arrived hundreds of miles from the sea. These ships were not just practical, they were works of art, adorned with carved dragon heads at the prow and tails at the stern, designed to intimidate before the first sword was drawn. When such a ship appeared on the horizon, its silhouette struck fear into even the bravest defenders. To those waiting on the shore, it looked less like a vessel and more like a beast rising out of the ocean. The sight alone was enough to make armies falter, peasants flee, and monasteries crumble into panic. But the genius of the longship lay not only in its design, but in the people who sailed it. Viking crews rowed in perfect rhythm, 30 to 60 men working as one, their chants echoing over the water, blending with the crash of waves. And when the winds favored them, they unfurled great square sails of wool, dyed with patterns that marked their clans, transforming the ships into swift predators of the sea. No coastline was safe, no river beyond reach, no fortress too far inland. The very geography of Europe became vulnerable because the Vikings had unlocked the ability to turn water into highways. The mastery of the longship was not simply about raiding, it was about vision. With these vessels, the Vikings expanded far beyond their northern homelands. They reached the British Isles, carved settlements in Ireland, founded Dublin and York, and even pushed into the heart of France. They sailed the Seine to Paris, the Volga to Russia, and the Mediterranean to Spain and Italy. Their ships carried them across the Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually to North America, centuries before Columbus. The longship was not only a tool of destruction, but also a vessel of discovery. And yet, for the people of Europe, it was the terror of raids that defined these ships. To hear the splash of oars at dawn was to know that time had run out. Entire towns could vanish in a single raid. Burned and plundered before neighboring villages even knew what had happened. The Viking speed was unmatched, and by the time word spread, the longships had vanished back into the sea, leaving only ashes and memories behind. The brilliance of the longship explains why the Viking Age lasted so long and spread so far. It was not brute strength alone that allowed these warriors to dominate, but technology, strategy, and a seafaring spirit unlike anything Europe had ever seen. When we speak of their raids, their settlements, their discoveries, we are in truth speaking of their ships. Without them, the Vikings would have been confined to the fords of Scandinavia. With them, they became legends, feared, admired, and remembered as the masters of the seas who bent Europe to their will. When the first Viking longships struck terror into Europe, they came only to raid. They burned, plundered, and disappeared back into the mist. Yet over time, something remarkable happened. The very raiders who arrived with fire in their hands began to stay, to build, and to weave themselves into the lands they once terrorized. This transformation from raiders to settlers reshaped Europe in ways that still echo today. What began as sudden strikes turned into entire communities as the Norsemen carved out strongholds that would one day grow into cities, kingdoms, and legacies lasting far beyond their lifetimes. Ireland, once a land of monasteries and fractured tribes, became one of their first great prizes. In 8041 AD, Vikings established a fortified camp along the river Liffey. What began as a simple base for raids evolved into the city we now know as Dublin. It was more than a camp. It became a bustling hub of trade where silks from the east, silver from the Arab world, and furs from the north all converged. From raiding to trading, the Vikings transformed themselves from destroyers into builders of markets and centers of power. Dublin would flourish under their influence. A living reminder that the Norsemen were not only warriors, but visionaries who understood the wealth of permanent roots. Across the sea in England, their impact was no less profound. Raids that once left towns in ashes soon gave way to settlements. By the mid-9th century, large swaths of northern and eastern England fell under Viking control. This territory became known as the Danelaw, where Norse laws, customs, and language intertwined with Anglo-Saxon traditions. Cities like York, once euphoric under the Anglo-Saxons, Apply became Jorvik under the Vikings, a thriving urban center alive with craftsmen, merchants, and farmers. The lines between conqueror and native blurred. Apply, and a new society was forged from their collision. The same pattern spread into France. In the early 10th century, Viking raiders relentlessly targeted the fertile valleys of the Seine. Apply, pushing even into Paris. Exhausted by constant attacks, King Charles the Simple made a bold choice. Rather than fight endlessly, he granted the Viking leader Rollo lands along the river. Apply, what was intended as a compromise birthed something greater, the Duchy of Normandy. Here, Norse settlers intermarried with the local population, adopting the French language and faith. Apply, yet never abandoning their fierce spirit. Within generations, their descendants would rise to unimaginable power. Apply, with William the Conqueror crossing the English Channel in 1066 to forever change the destiny of Europe. But what drove these raiders to settle? Apply, part of the answer lies in the harshness of their Scandinavian homelands. Long winters, limited farmland, and growing populations pushed them outward. Raiding brought wealth. Apply, but settlement offered permanence. Fertile lands, political opportunity, and trade networks promised a future their rocky fords could not. And so, Apply, villages grew where monasteries once burned and marketplaces rose where ships had once unleashed terror. Yet the transformation was not immediate, nor was it peaceful. Apply, settlements were born in blood as much as in trade. Local populations resisted fiercely, kingdoms clashed, and entire cultures were forced to adapt. But gradually, Apply, the Norse presence became less an invasion and more a fabric woven into Europe itself. Their language seeped into English, leaving behind words still spoken today. Apply, their traditions shaped laws and governance. Their descendants ruled not as outsiders, but as kings and dukes of Europe's great realms. What began as plunder became permanence. Apply, the Viking axe gave way to the farmer's plow, and the Longships' roar turned into the hum of bustling towns. Their brutal raids may have opened the door, Apply, but it was their settlements that ensured their legacy. In Dublin, York, Normandy, and beyond, the Vikings left behind not ruins but beginnings. And in those beginnings, Apply, Europe was forever reshaped by the very people it once feared most. The ringing of church bells across medieval Europe once meant peace, safety, and a call to prayer. Apply, but in the age of the Vikings, those bells often became alarm signals, the first desperate warning that death was near. Of all the places the Norsemen struck, Apply, monasteries were among their most frequent and most vulnerable targets. To the faithful, these sacred sanctuaries were houses of God. To the Vikings, Apply, they were vaults overflowing with wealth, guarded not by warriors but by monks clutching their scriptures. And so, again and again, flames consumed holy walls, Apply, and the cries of prayer were drowned out by the clash of steel. The monasteries held treasures unlike any village or town. Gold and silver chalices, jeweled crosses, Apply, illuminated manuscripts bound in precious covers. These were irresistible prizes to raiders who measured victory by the weight of plunder. But beyond material wealth, Apply, monasteries held something even greater fear. By striking the beating heart of Christendom, the Vikings undermined Europe's sense of security in faith itself. Apply, if holy places could burn, then nowhere was truly safe. The chronicles of the time describe the horror in vivid detail. At Lindisfarne, the first great raid, Apply, the monks were dragged from their altars, slaughtered, or taken as slaves. At Iona, an island monastery off the coast of Scotland, the Vikings struck not once but multiple times, Apply, killing dozens of holy men and scattering their sacred relics. Across Ireland, France, and England, monasteries became smoldering ruins. Apply, their libraries of priceless manuscripts lost to the fire. In every charred wall, in every broken altar, the message was clear: the Northmen feared no God. Apply, and no sanctuary could withstand them. Yet behind the savagery lay ruthless logic. Monasteries were rich, poorly defended, Apply, and often isolated along coasts and rivers, perfect targets for swift longship raids. A band of raiders could land at dawn, seize everything of value, Apply, and vanish before any army could arrive. The monks, untrained in war, could offer little resistance. For the Vikings, it was an efficient strategy. For Europe, it was humiliation. Apply, the impact went far beyond the loss of wealth. Monasteries were the keepers of learning in a dark and violent age. They preserved history, copied ancient texts, Apply, and educated the few who could read. When their libraries burned, knowledge itself was erased. Each raid was not only an assault on faith, but on culture and memory. Apply, Europe's heritage blood ink as much as it blood. The psychological toll was immense. People asked, how could God allow pagans to defile his most sacred places? Apply. Priests thundered from pulpits, warning that the raids were divine punishment for sin. Kings struggled to defend their realms, fortifying coastlines and building watchtowers, Apply. But the Longships seemed unstoppable. The Vikings had found Europe's greatest weakness, and they exploited it mercilessly. But there is another side to this tale, Apply. Not all who raided remained destroyers. Some Vikings who once set monasteries aflame later converted to Christianity themselves, marrying into local families and even founding churches. Apply. In Normandy, the descendants of Rollo, once a feared Viking raider, became devout patrons of Christianity, blending Norse ferocity with European faith. Apply. The paradox of the Vikings is that they were both the scourge and eventually the servants of the very religion they once desecrated. Still apply. The image of burning monasteries lingers as one of the darkest shadows of the Viking Age. The glow of fire against night skies, the shrieks of fleeing monks. Apply. And the echo of shattered bells became symbols of terror across Europe. In those moments, the Vikings were not just raiders, they were storms given human form. Apply, tearing through the spiritual heart of a continent. And though centuries have passed, the memory of monastery flames remains one of the most haunting chapters in Europe's story. Apply. Across Europe, kings ruled with crowns of iron and faith, yet even the mightiest of them trembled at the whispers of Viking sails on the horizon. These Norse raiders, apply, with their longships cutting through rivers and seas, held power far greater than their numbers suggested, and though kings commanded armies, castles, and kingdoms, apply, the very idea of a Viking raid struck fear deep into their thrones. The chronicles of the time are filled with desperate rulers forced into choices no monarch wished to make: fight, apply, flee, or pay the price of survival. Take the reign of Charlemagne, the great emperor who sought to unite Europe under his banner. Even he, apply, the warrior king whose name carried weight across Christendom, faced the shadow of Viking terror. Though Charlemagne managed to push them back during his lifetime, apply, he knew well the danger they posed. His heirs, less formidable than he, were not so lucky. The Carolingian Empire, divided among his descendants, became easy prey. Apply, the Vikings poured into rivers like the Seine and the Loire, plundering Paris and other great cities, while kings and princes scrambled to defend lands that seemed forever vulnerable. Apply, the humiliation reached its peak when rulers found themselves paying the very men they called barbarians, known as Danegeld. Apply, this payment was essentially ransom, treasure given in exchange for peace. Kings opened their coffers, handing over silver, gold, and sometimes even land. Apply, all to keep Viking flames from devouring their towns. The payments bought temporary safety, but they also fed the raiders' hunger. With every coin handed over, the Vikings grew bolder. Apply, knowing that Europe's rulers were willing to pay instead of fight. Paris itself endured one of the most famous sieges of the Viking Age. In 8045 AD, apply, a fleet led by the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok sailed up the Seine with more than 100 ships. The city, unprepared for such an onslaught, watched as the invaders surrounded them. Apply, King Charles the Bald, desperate to save Paris, paid the Vikings an enormous sum of silver to leave. The city was spared for the moment, but the damage was done. Apply, Europe now knew that even its greatest capitals could be held hostage by the Longships. The fear was not limited to France. In England, kings faced relentless waves of Viking attacks. Apply, monasteries burned, towns were seized, and entire regions fell under Norse control. Kings like Thorwald the Unready would later pour vast sums into Danegeld. Apply, bankrupting their kingdoms in a futile attempt to buy safety. The Vikings understood the weakness of divided leadership, and they used it mercilessly. Where kings hesitated, apply, the Norse struck swiftly. And yet some rulers rose to meet the challenge. Alfred the Great of Wessex became one of the few monarchs to push back, reforming his defenses. Apply, creating fortified towns and even building a navy to counter the Longships. But his victories were rare exceptions. For most kings, apply, the Viking threat loomed like a storm cloud that never lifted. What made the terror so profound was not just the raids themselves, but the unpredictability. Apply, a Viking fleet could appear on any coast, at any river, without warning. No fortress seemed strong enough, no army fast enough. Apply, kings who had spent their lives believing in their divine right to rule suddenly realized that their crowns offered no protection against the dragon, proud ships from the north. Apply, in the end, the Vikings forced Europe's rulers to change. Some fortified their cities, some restructured armies, and some, like the kings of France, apply, even turned raiders into allies by granting them land, Normandy being the most famous example. But in the centuries when Viking sails haunted the horizon, apply, kings across Europe lived not as masters of their realms, but as men forever aware that at any moment the sea could deliver an enemy too fierce to ignore. Apply, the terror of the Vikings was not just on the battlefield. It sat in royal halls, whispered in councils, and haunted every monarch who knew the Northmen were never far away. Apply, though centuries have passed since the last Viking longship slipped beneath the waves, the legacy of those Norse warriors still lingers all around us, often in ways we hardly notice. Apply, the Viking Age may have ended, but its imprint on Europe is carved into language, law, culture, and identity, a shadow stretching across time. Apply, reminding us that the raiders who once terrorized kingdoms also helped shape them. What was born out of fire raids Apply. And conquest grew into a legacy that continues to live on in the everyday life of millions. Walk through the streets of York in England, once the Viking stronghold of Jorvik. Apply, and echoes of Norse culture still whisper from the stones. Excavations reveal layers of history where Viking artisans worked their craft, merchants traded, and families built lives. Apply. What was once a captured city became a place where cultures fused, creating a hybrid society that blended Anglo-Saxon and Norse traditions. Even today, festivals celebrate this heritage. Apply, with reenactments and crafts keeping the spirit of Jorvik alive. Language is perhaps the clearest legacy of the Viking presence. When the Norsemen settled across Europe, apply. Their Old Norse tongue mixed with local dialects, leaving behind words that remain in modern English. Apply. Everyday terms like or sky, ag, knife, and window trace their roots back to the Vikings. Even the days of the week carry their memory. Thursday, for instance, apply, honors Thor, the god of thunder, long after their ships vanished. The Vikings' words stayed, woven into the very way people speak. Apply. Their influence stretched into the foundations of law and governance as well. In the Danelaw of England, Norse legal customs merged with Anglo-Saxon traditions. Apply, creating systems that would endure for centuries. Concepts of trial by jury and community-based justice were strengthened under their rule. In Normandy, apply, Viking descendants became dukes who embraced French culture yet retained the warrior spirit of their ancestors. These Norman leaders would go on to reshape Europe. Apply, none more famously than William the Conqueror, whose victory at Hastings in 1066 tied England and Normandy together, altering the course of Western history. Beyond politics and language, apply, the Vikings shaped trade and exploration. Their networks stretched from the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the bustling markets of Byzantium. Apply, linking Europe to Asia in ways few before them had achieved. They carried not just silver and furs, but ideas, technology, and culture. Apply. This web of exchange helped Europe emerge from isolation into a world connected by rivers and seas. The very idea of globalization, long before the modern age, Apply had roots in Viking trade routes. And yet, their legacy is not only in the things they built, but also in the myths they left behind. The sagas passed down through generations. Apply told stories of gods, heroes, and distant voyages. These tales, preserved in Icelandic texts, inspired centuries of literature, art, and imagination. Apply. From Wagner's operas to modern television dramas, the Viking image continues to captivate. Apply. They are remembered not only as warriors, but as storytellers whose myths still breathe life into our culture. Apply. Perhaps the most enduring part of their legacy lies in how they changed Europe's identity. By breaking borders, challenging kings, and forcing kingdoms to adapt, Apply. They accelerated the unification of regions and the strengthening of states. Their raids compelled rulers to innovate in defense, governance, and diplomacy. Out of chaos, Apply, new orders arose stronger and more resilient because they had faced the storm of the North. Today, Apply, when we hear the word Viking, we often imagine horned helmets and roaring warriors. But their true legacy is more subtle and far-reaching. It is found in the words we speak, Apply, the laws we follow, the cities we live in, and the stories we tell. They were destroyers, but also creators. They were feared, but also admired. Apply, and though their age of conquest is long over, the world they helped shape remains, proof that even the fiercest storms leave behind a foundation on which the future is built.